Be not far from us, for trouble is near. Please be seated. Good Friday. We celebrate this liturgy every year, but it never gets comfortable, does it? Here we sit in the dark moment, cradling within us all these big feelings of grief and maybe fear and an awareness of our inconsequence compared to the evil powers of this world. We feel the loneliness of the moment, the temptation to recognize despair as our only companion. And yet we also know that the dark moment is not the end of the story, but is instead an invitation for us to choose to hope. Most of my favorite stories have a dark moment before the denouement, when it seems that all hope is lost, and the story or the characters nearly succumb to despair. In the third book of The Lord of the Rings, the mouth of Sauron displays Frodo's mithril armor to the remaining members of the Fellowship, convincing them, and the reader, that Frodo may have died on his quest to destroy the ring. In Pride and Prejudice, it happens when Lydia runs off with Wickham, and Elizabeth realizes, too late, what she's lost in Darcy. In these moments of crisis, the characters feel isolated, abandoned, hopeless. And yet behind the scenes, the mechanisms of ultimate triumph are already in place. While the Fellowship confronts the mouth of Sauron at the Black Gate, Frodo and Sam are already on their way up the side of Mount Doom. While Elizabeth sits in quiet despair, mourning her lost love and her lost sister, Darcy is in London, working to find Lydia and to negotiate a shotgun wedding with Wickham and to repair the social standing of the Bennet family. There is a tension in all of these stories at the approach of the crisis. And when I read them, I feel a visceral pull, a yearning for the resolution. I read faster, and I'll stay up way too late to finish a book, even one I have read many times over. John's gospel this evening leaves us in the bleak moment. Christ has died. He suffered and was rejected by his people. He endured the violence of cynical empire. He bore many griefs and felt the cold darkness of separation. In John's telling of the Passion narrative, Jesus has been abandoned by most of his closest friends. His last moments are observed by the quietly watching women, including his mother and one faithful disciple. While Jesus does not quote the Psalms in John's narrative, we can't help but link the poetry of Psalm 22 to Jesus' lonely experience of physical suffering on behalf of love. My God, why have you forsaken me? The readings and liturgy of our service today encourage us to sit with the discomfort of a story suspended at its crisis point, to let the moment stretch so that we might expand our expectations of what God can do, how God can take our dark, lonely moments and transform them, how God can liberate us from everything that separates us from loving community and restore us to abundant life, even when such a thing seems impossible. Psalm 22 gives eloquent voice to the dark moment of isolation and grief. The psalmist cries out in despair, disconnected from his community and beset on all sides by enemies. He believes that his neighbors hold him in reproach, and he worries that his suffering may be deserved. After all, if God wanted to, if God delighted in the psalmist, God could deliver him. The psalmist seems to believe that the existence of his suffering is the proof that he should suffer, that he deserves it. So he removes himself from the community and suffers alone. And yet, by the end of the psalm, as he reflects on the Lord's goodness and reaches out to his community, he finds hope. No longer isolated in his despair, the psalmist encourages everyone to praise the Lord and give glory because of God's faithfulness. This God who does not hide their face from the poor and who hears them when they cry. The servant whom Isaiah describes also suffers many griefs. He is scorned, despised, rejected. Yet despite his separation from the people, those who scorned and despised him, he takes their many iniquities and griefs upon himself and bears them. I think it's important for us to realize that they are our iniquities corporate, not just individual. The servant, this unblemished lamb led to slaughter, carries our failings as a society, as well as our individual failings, and transforms them into opportunities for grace and reconciliation on both an individual level and a broad community-wide scale. And this servant who bent so low under the weight of all of our grief is lifted up, raised, and exalted. He startles the nations, jolting them out of their complacency. Through him, the Lord's will is accomplished, and the darkness turns to light. He intercedes for the transgressors, removing the sins that kept them separate from the Lord. Our epistle reading references the promise of a new covenant with God, in which God will write on our hearts and on our minds, restoring us to relationship with God and with each other, so that we no longer require the intercession of sacrifice, because there is no sacrifice greater than Christ's willing walk to the cross and death. As a people and as individuals in covenant with God, with the words of hope in our hearts, we have a responsibility to one another, within the church and within the world. We are instructed to provoke one another to love and good deeds, to encourage one another to act in love and faithfulness. After 2 years of pandemic disruptions and the isolation, grief, and anxiety that have become so deeply ingrained in our new normal, the repeated invitation to seek out community and to find ways to connect with others, to trust in Jesus' command that we should find our identity as people who strive to love, is especially difficult. But tomorrow, we will gather in person or online to hold one another in love and in grief while we celebrate the lives of 2 beloved members of our community, in the full confidence of our hope that this moment, is not the end of the story. On the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished." But he knew the rest of the story. He knew that reversal and transformation lay waiting in the wings. The cold darkness is temporary. Christ himself is the light. We would do well to remember, even as we reflect on Christ's sacrifice, that ours is a resurrection story, oriented always toward redemption and the ultimate triumph of God over anything that might separate us from love. Even in the darkest moments, when we feel forsaken, cast out, cut off from God's promises, God is there, lighting the way through Christ. And the warm welcome of community waits in the wings for us, ready to listen, to share the burdens of grief, to offer healing, and to stand by our side as we comfort one another and as we venture forth to reflect Christ's light into the world. And for that, thanks be to God.